Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show where we really try to get to the heart of what's shaping our world.
Great to be here.
We often hear about global conflicts, and the narrative is usually resources, politics, ideology.
Right, the standard explanations.
But here's something to think about. How often have people really fought primarily over just those things? Maybe less often than we assume.
That's a really interesting starting point. Because while, yeah, economics and politics are obviously huge factors, sometimes the deeper currents, the real drivers, run along lines of cultural identity.
Exactly. And that brings us to today's deep dive. We're tackling a really pivotal idea, one that honestly shook up how people thought about international relations after the Cold War.
We're unpacking Samuel Huntington's hugely influential and, yeah, often pretty controversial 1993 article, and later his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order.
Right. And his central argument, the core of it, was that cultural identity, would basically replace ideology or economics as the main engine of global conflict.
That was the big claim.
So our mission today is to explore that. Look at his evidence, the conflict zones, the hot spots he pointed to, and think about what it all means for understanding global politics. Maybe even how we see our own identities.
And that 1993 article in Foreign Affairs, wow, it wasn't just another academic piece.
No,
it really struck a nerve. The editors there said it generated more discussion in just 3 years than anything since George Kennan's famous X article back in the 40s.
Wow, Kennan's containment article, that's huge. So it really landed with impact.
It absolutely did. It offered this completely different way of looking at the world order that was emerging. A new paradigm, really.
Okay, paradigm shift.
That's
strong. What exactly was Huntington arguing that felt so revolutionary back then as the Cold War dust settled?
Well, his core point was this.
Yeah.
The big ideological fight, communism versus capitalism, was over. Right. So the really critical distinctions, the things that divided people most fundamentally, weren't political systems anymore. They were cultural. Things like shared history, language, religion, traditions, customs.
So the deep stuff.
Exactly, the deep stuff. And that, he argued, was redrawing the map of global politics, shifting where the future conflicts, the fault lines, would actually be.
And when he talked about culture, it wasn't just like food and music, was it? He meant something much more foundational.
Well, absolutely. Much deeper. He defined civilizations as the biggest cultural grouping people identify with, like the highest level beyond the nation state, shaped by shared philosophical views, core values, how society is structured, customs, just the whole outlook on life.
And he identified specific ones.
He did. The major ones he saw were Sinic, meaning Chinese culture and its sphere, Japanese, which he saw as distinct, Hindu, mainly India, Islamic, stretching right across North Africa, the Middle East to Indonesia, Western, Europe and North America, Orthodox, centered on Russia, and Latin American. He also sort of floated the idea of a possible African civilization emerging.
So it's like drawing a new world map, but the borders are these broad cultural zones, like tectonic plates almost.
That's a great analogy.
And where these plates grind against each other, that's where you get the friction, the fault lines.
Precisely. Those are the zones he predicted would be most prone to conflict.
And did he point to examples back then? Where were these hot spots lighting up?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at the fighting in Bosnia back then. You had Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Bosnian Muslims. It lined up almost perfectly with these civilizational...
Right, a tragic example.
In Chechnya. The Caucasus region, like Armenians versus Azeris. Central Asia, Kashmir, the Middle East, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sudan. He saw these conflicts as fitting that pattern, driven more by these deep cultural identities than just, say, Cold War proxy fights or resource grabs.
It makes you wonder, why did he think culture mattered that much? Why couldn't these groups find common ground based on, I don't know, shared economic interests or political goals?
Well, Huntington's argument was that the big differences you see in how societies develop politically and economically are actually rooted in their distinct cultures. So, for instance, he'd connect the economic dynamism in East Asia to certain cultural values there, like thrift, discipline, focus on the group.
Right, the Asian values debate sort of thing.
Exactly. And conversely, he suggested that difficulties in establishing stable Western-style democracy in some parts of the Muslim world might be linked to aspects of Islamic culture and history. For him, these cultural factors weren't superficial. They were fundamental to how societies functioned and, potentially clashed.
It definitely gives you a different lens to look through, doesn't it? When you say conflicts today, you can start thinking beyond just the surface level politics or economics,
Yeah.
and consider these deeper historical, cultural currents.
It offers a more nuanced framework for sure.
Okay, so if cultural identity is shaping conflict, it must also be reshaping the global balance of power, right? Because Huntington definitely saw some major shifts happening there.
Oh, absolutely. Seismic shifts. He pointed out that, yeah, the West was still the most powerful civilization at the time he was writing, but its relative slice of the pie, political, economic, military power, had actually been shrinking for decades.
Yep.
Since the 1920s, really.
That long.
Yeah. He cited figures like the West having maybe 64% of the gross world product in 1950, but by the 1980s, that was down to 49%. And projections then put around 30% by 2013. That's a really significant long-term trend away from Western dominance.
And this decline was happening just as other civilizations were, well, rising, what he called the challenger civilizations.
Exactly. You have this incredible economic boom happening in East Asia. Japan, the four tigers like South Korea and Taiwan, then China starting its massive growth, Southeast Asian nations like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, even India starting to pick up steam.
Growth rates that were just staggering.
Yeah, 8–10% a year, sometimes more. And this wasn't just about money. This economic success fueled a huge boost in confidence, a real affirmation of their own cultures. They started stressing their own values: thrift, family, hard work, discipline, often linked to Confucianism, and pushing back against what they saw as Western individualism.
So it wasn't just catching up economically, it was asserting cultural difference.
Precisely. A rise in confidence, not just capital. And it wasn't only Asia.
Right, you mentioned the Islamic world too.
Yes, starting around the 1970s, you saw this pervasive cultural, social, and political resurgence of Islam right across the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia. Often this came with a pretty explicit rejection of Western values and institutions.
How did that manifest?
Leaders began increasingly identifying with Islam publicly, weaving Islamic symbols and language into their regimes. Even secular-leaning leaders or monarchs, like King Hussein of Jordan, King Hassan of Morocco, or Suharto in Indonesia, started emphasizing their Islamic identity more.
Interesting. And demographics played a role here too, didn't they? Huntington talked about the youth bulge.
Hugely important. He highlighted this large cohort of young people, say 15 to 24 years old, in many Muslim countries. This demographic, he argued, provided the recruits for various movements: fundamentalism, sometimes terrorism or insurgency, but also migration.
Creating pressure.
Yeah, creating destabilizing pressures, both inside those countries and on their neighbors, including Western nations. He even mentioned Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia at the time, identifying youth fundamentalism as the biggest threat.
This connects to another point he made, challenging that whole idea of a single, universal civilization emerging. The Western view might be, oh, global media, McDonald's everywhere, we're all becoming the same.
Right, benign global integration.
But Huntington said, not so fast. Non-Westerners often saw that as just Western imperialism in a new guise.
Exactly. He had that great line, entertainment does not equate to cultural conversion.
Right.
Just because people watch Hollywood movies doesn't mean they're adopting Western values. He used the example of cruise missile strikes on Baghdad. Western audiences might cheer, while non-Western audiences saw it completely differently as attacks on fellow non-Westerners. Same image, opposite reaction.
That's a powerful example. What about something like English becoming the global language? Doesn't that foster unity?
Well, Huntington argued that English functions as a lingua franca, a practical tool for communication between different cultures. But its use actually presupposes those separate cultures exist.
Ah, okay. It doesn't erase the differences.
No, it's a tool, not a source of identity. He gave the example of German-speaking and French-speaking Swiss using English to talk to each other. They're not becoming English. They're just finding a practical way to communicate across their existing cultural divide.
So the big picture here is demographic shifts, economic power moving, leading to this confident assertion of non-Western cultures. It's a world becoming more multipolar and culturally distinct, not converging into one Western model.
Absolutely. Which completely changes how you think about global power and conflict.
Okay, let's drill down into the conflict dynamics along those fault lines. This is where Huntington made one of his most debated statements. He flat out said, Islam has bloody borders. That's quite a claim. What was his justification?
It was provocative and highly controversial, but he backed it up with conflict data available at the time. He argued that statistically, the overwhelming majority of these fault line conflicts were happening along the boundaries separating Muslim populations from non-Muslims across Eurasia into Africa.
So he was pointing to a pattern in the data.
Yes. He also noted things like Muslim countries in the 1980s tended to have higher ratios of military personnel to population and, statistically, showed a greater propensity for violence and international crises compared to, say, Christian countries at that time. He presented it as an empirical observation based on conflict patterns, not necessarily a judgment on the religion itself.
Okay, so if he observed that pattern, what reasons did he give for why this might be happening? Why this apparent high level of conflict along those specific borders?
He suggested a few potential factors. One was just historical legacy.
Yeah.
Long histories of conflict between certain groups can breed deep mistrust. Another was the demographic pressure we talked about, the youth bulge providing manpower for conflict.
Right.
He also floated the idea that the legacy of Western imperialism had perhaps created an image of Muslim weakness, which paradoxically might embolden non-Muslim groups on their borders. And he did also raise the possibility that Muslims might be reacting, like other groups perceived as victims, to a sense of widespread anti-Muslim prejudice.
It sounds incredibly complex. And in these kinds of wars, these fault line wars, identities don't stay fluid, do they? They tend to harden.
Absolutely. What might have been a more casual sense of identity can become incredibly rigid. A stark us versus them mentality takes over. And often, the moderate voices get pushed aside.
How so?
Well, moderates might initially push for limited goals like autonomy or more rights within an existing state. But as the conflict escalates, they often get replaced by radicals who are committed to more extreme goals, independence maybe, or religious purity, and are willing to use violence to achieve them. He saw this dynamic playing out in places like the Philippines with the Moro conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Chechnya.
Where initial movements became more hardline over time.
Exactly. More extreme, often more religiously defined.
Another really interesting dynamic he described was kin country rallying. The idea that whole civilizations sort of line up behind their members in these conflicts.
Yes. The former Yugoslavia was the textbook example he used.
Right, you mentioned it earlier.
You had Germany, Austria, the Vatican strongly backing Catholic Croatia.
Yeah.
Then Russia and Greece were supporting Orthodox Serbia. And meanwhile, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, other Muslim nations rallied to support the Bosnian Muslims. It was like the whole civilizational family showing up.
A pattern repeated elsewhere, too.
He argued it was a consistent feature of these fault line conflicts.
Hmm.
Civilizational kin tend to support their own.
Okay, now this is where it gets really fascinating and maybe counterintuitive. The Confucian-Islamic connection. I mean, culturally, Cynic and Islamic civilizations seem worlds apart. What possible common ground could lead them to cooperate, especially against the West?
It is counterintuitive if you only think about shared values. But Huntington argued their cooperation stemmed from having a common perceived opponent or adversary.
The enemy of my enemy.
Sort of.
Yeah.
This cooperation played out on several fronts. They often aligned on human rights issues at the UN, pushing back against Western pressure. There was economic cooperation. But the really crucial area he highlighted was weapons proliferation.
What?
Yes, especially the transfer of weapons of mass destruction or the technology to build them and advanced missile systems. He identified China, a core Cynic state, as a key supplier to various Islamist states like Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and also to North Korea. He even talked about a potential Tehran-Islamabad-Beijing axis emerging.
That sounds like something out of a geopolitical thriller. And connected to this, the drive for nuclear weapons. He saw a specific reason for that, linked to Western power.
He did. He argued the big lesson non-Western states took from the first Gulf War was basically, don't pick a fight with the United States unless you have nuclear weapons.
The ultimate deterrent.
Exactly. Nuclear weapons became seen as the equalizer for states that couldn't compete with the West's overwhelming conventional military superiority. And he noted that efforts to develop WMDs seemed concentrated in Islamic and Confucian states. Pakistan and North Korea already having some capability then, and Iran making, as he put it, strenuous efforts.
It really paints a picture of global conflict that's far more complex than the old Cold War bipolarity. You've got these deep historical issues, cultural identity fueling conflict, and then these unexpected alliances based on shared opposition, not shared ideals.
It's a very different map of the world, absolutely.
So we've talked about civilizations clashing at the borders, these fault lines, and forming these alliances. But what about countries that are kind of stuck in the middle, caught between civilizations? Huntington had a name for those too, right?
He did. He called them torn countries.
Torn countries. Okay, what defines a torn country?
It's basically a nation that has a large, predominant culture belonging to one civilization, but its leaders are actively trying to shift the country's identity and alignment towards a different civilization, usually trying to join the West.
Okay, so it's an internal struggle over identity, led from the top. How is that different from what he called cleft countries?
Cleft countries are different because they have large populations belonging to different civilizations living within the same borders. Think of the former Yugoslavia before its breakup, or Sudan, or India. Torn countries have one dominant culture, but the leadership wants to change its civilizational team, so to speak.
Got it. So what's the classic example of a torn country, according to Huntington?
Turkey. Absolutely the textbook case. Ever since the 1920s with Ataturk and the Kemalist Revolution.
Right, secularization, westernization.
Exactly. Turkey systematically tried to modernize by adopting Western models. They changed the script from Arabic to Roman, adopted the Gregorian calendar, secularized the state, embraced Western legal and political systems. This whole strategy, the Kemalist response, was based on the idea that to become modern, you had to become Western.
And they joined NATO, tried to join the EU.
For decades, they joined NATO, or an associate member of the European community. But Huntington pointed out that ultimately Europe, specifically Brussels, kept them at arm's length. The unspoken reason, he suggested, was cultural and religious. We are Christian, and they are Muslim.
A fundamental civilizational difference blocking integration.
That was the argument. And this rejection, combined with the broader Islamic resurgence we talked about, led Turkey to start looking elsewhere towards Central Asia, exploring leadership of a revived Turkic world, a sort of Tashkent option, while Turkish politics itself became more visibly Islamic.
A profound identity crisis. What about Russia? He saw Russia as torn, too.
Yes, he argued Russia has been torn since Peter the Great in the 17th century, constantly grappling with this question. Is Russia the eastern flank of Western civilization, or is it the core of his own distinct Eurasian Orthodox civilization?
The Westernizers versus the Slavophiles or Eurasianists.
Exactly that historical debate. He pointed to figures like Yeltsin in the early 90s, trying hard to align Russia with the West, but facing huge pushback from nationalists who emphasized Russia's unique path. Public opinion polls back then showed Russians themselves were deeply divided on where they belonged.
Another case. Mexico. How did that fit the torn model?
Well, traditionally Mexico had defined itself partly in opposition to the U.S., but starting in the 1980s, Huntington saw a major shift where Mexican leaders began trying to imitate the U.S. and integrate North America, most obviously through NAFTA.
Moving away from a purely Latin American identity.
That was the idea. Undertaking major economic reforms to align more closely with the U.S. and Canada, even if there was internal resistance and they couldn't always explicitly say they were trying to become North American.
And then there's a really unusual one, Australia, a Western country trying to become Asian.
Yeah, that was unique. Australia, clearly a Western society, historically and culturally, making a conscious effort under leaders like Prime Minister Paul Keating to sort of defect from the West, as Huntington put it. By redefining itself as an Asian nation, pushing for enmeshment in Asia, talking about becoming a republic to cut ties with the British monarchy. Keating famously said Australia needed to stop being a branch office of empire.
Did Huntington think that would work?
He was pretty skeptical. He pointed to ambivalence within Australia itself, but also, crucially, resistance from Asian leaders.
Right.
Figures like Malaysia's Mahathir Mohamad basically said, "You're not one of us."
Why not?
Fundamental cultural differences. They pointed to Australia's democratic values, focus on human rights, even its more direct, confrontational diplomatic style as being distinctly Western, not Asian. Culture was the barrier.
So looking at all these cases, Turkey, Russia, Mexico, Australia, there seems to be a pattern. This Kemalist response, the idea you can just adopt Western ways wholesale to modernize, it doesn't really work.
That was Huntington's conclusion. For non-Western societies, simply trying to copy the West was unlikely to succeed and could even be counterproductive. Modernization, he argued, had to happen in ways that were compatible with their own indigenous cultures and traditions.
Like Japan's model, maybe? Japanese spirit, Western technique.
Exactly like that. Building on your own cultural foundations,
Yeah.
rather than trying to replace them entirely.
It really underscores how powerful culture is, doesn't it? Even when leaders push hard for change, a nation's deep-seated identity and civilizational alignment often exert a stronger pull. Political will might not be enough.
It seems culture often dictates the terms of engagement with the rest of the world.
Okay, so given all these global dynamics, clashes, alliances, torn countries, what did Huntington see for the future of the West itself? He wasn't just looking outward, he also focused on internal challenges, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He was quite pointed about what he saw as serious internal pressures and potential weaknesses within Western civilization.
Such as,
Well, he talked about signs of what he termed moral decline, things like increases in antisocial behavior crime, drug use decay in family structures like rising divorce rates, more single-parent households, and specifically in the U.S., he worried about a decline in social capital.
social capital, meaning,
Basically, the networks, norms, and trust that enable people to act together effectively. He saw evidence of this declining in things like lower participation in community groups, voluntary associations, and even declining levels of trust between people.
and didn't he also see a specific threat from multiculturalism, particularly in the U.S.?
Yes, he identified that as a particularly dangerous challenge. He argued that some forms of multiculturalism were actively attacking the idea of the United States being fundamentally part of Western civilization.
Oh.
By denying a common American culture derived from European Western roots and instead promoting separate, subnational group identities based on ethnicity or ancestry.
Hmm.
He even quoted Teddy Roosevelt, warning against America becoming just a tangle of squabbling nationalities. He saw it as potentially undermining national unity.
That's a strong critique. He also mentioned a kind of paradox related to promoting democracy abroad, right?
Yeah, this was interesting. The West pushes democracy as a universal value. But Huntington pointed out that in some non-Western societies, truly free elections could ironically bring anti-Western governments to power.
Like where?
He cited Algeria in 1992, where an Islamist party, the FIS, was on the verge of winning elections before the military stepped in, or the rise of the Islamic Welfare Party in Turkey. The result: Western enthusiasm for promoting democracy in those places suddenly cooled off quite a bit.
A bit awkward when democracy doesn't produce the right results from a Western perspective.
Precisely. So, despite all these challenges, internal and external, Huntington still emphasized the unique character of Western civilization. Its value wasn't that it was universal, but that it was unique.
Unique in what way?
He argued its distinctiveness came from a specific combination of values and institutions developed over centuries: Christianity, pluralism, different centers of power in society, individualism, and the rule of law protecting individual rights against state power. These, he said, were fundamentally European ideas, not Asian nor African nor Middle Eastern ideas, except by adoption.
So the goal shouldn't be to make everyone else Western, but to preserve what's unique about the West.
That seemed to be his implication. And related to that, how do we avoid these major intercivilizational wars he feared? He actually laid out 3 basic rules for peace for this new multipolar, multi-civilizational world.
Okay, what were they?
Rule number 1 was the abstention rule. Basically, core states, the leading states of each civilization, must avoid intervening in conflicts happening within other civilizations.
Stay out of other civilizations' internal or regional fights sounds simple.
But, as he noted, historically very difficult, especially for interventionist powers like the U.S.
Okay, what's rule 2?
The joint mediation rule. When conflicts do break out along those fault lines between civilizations, the core states from the evolved civilizations should negotiate with each other to contain or stop the fighting, direct diplomacy between the major civilizational powers.
So great power cooperation to manage local conflicts makes sense. And the third rule?
The commonalities rule. This is about finding shared ground. Peoples in all civilizations should actively search for and try to expand the values, institutions, and practices they actually hold in common.
Looking for universals, but from the ground up.
Kind of. He mentioned Singapore's deliberate effort to identify core values shared by its Chinese, Malay, and Indian citizens as an example. He thought there might be a thin, universal morality underlying major religions' basic concepts of right and wrong that could form a minimal basis for peaceful coexistence, emerging gradually through mutual understanding, not imposition.
This whole section really prompts reflection, doesn't it? Thinking about the strengths and weaknesses within our own societies and how understanding these deep cultural differences is crucial not just for foreign policy, but maybe for internal cohesion, too.
Absolutely. It forces you to think about what holds societies together and what drives them apart, both internally and externally.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, the big takeaway really seems to be this powerful argument that cultural identity, these deep civilizational bonds, fundamentally reshaped world politics after the Cold War.
Yeah, that's the core message. It leads to different kinds of conflict, different alliances, ones that just don't fit neatly into the old ideological or purely economic boxes.
We've seen the arguments about Western decline, the rise in cultural affirmation of Asia, the resurgence of Islam and its demographic weight, the struggles of these torn countries trying to switch civilizational allegiances. It all points to a world defined more by these broad cultural groupings.
It paints a picture of civilizations as the primary players on the global stage, shaped by history, religion, values, language, all those deep cultural elements.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a pretty profound question to mull over. If Huntington is right, or even partly right, that the West's biggest challenge might not be external military threats, but maybe this internal cultural erosion or moral decline you worried about. What does that mean? What could individuals, communities, leaders actually do to perhaps preserve or renew the unique positive qualities of their own civilization, whatever it may be, while also contributing to a more stable, peaceful, multi-civilizational world? What stands out to you listening today about how this perspective might shift how you view global events?
A lot to think about there.